Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome to the channel. Today I'm doing a really quick run through of the Edexcel Medicine Through Time GCSE, but I'm focusing on care for the sick because this is a category that you probably will get asked about. Typically the board focuses on treatments and preventions and surgery. Obviously they can all link together in one way or another. But the other thing that they might look for is care for the sick. So this typically is a bit more stringent on boards like AQA, but it's helpful to know for Edexcel as well, just so that your answers are obviously super clear and straightforward on what you're looking at. So in terms of periods of time then, so obviously we start in the Middle Ages or the medieval period, whatever you'd like to say. So in this period, the church runs over 30% of the hospitals. And a good example would be the Hôtel Dieu de Paris hospital, or you could use obviously a different one. But they are the ones that are running the show in terms of caring for the sick. So they prioritised caring for the sick over curing the ill. So illness is often seen as divine punishment, or some sort of punishment for something or other. Obviously they don't really understand anything to do with illness like we do now, so it is all based on things like religion or astrology and so on. So church hospitals are normally linked to a convent or a monastery, and monks and nuns are the ones that care for the sick. So a good part of this is that they do clean the hospitals. So actually, it was probably better for a lot of people to be in a monastery hospital because it would be being cleaned. They would, for example, actually change the bed sheets, which obviously people weren't really doing. However, they do still have to share beds. So say that you are getting better, you might have to share a bed with somebody who's really not, and that brings you down. So obviously there are major hindrances here, and they're focusing on care rather than cure. Another thing of note is that they would turn specific people away. An example would be somebody who they would see as just insane. Obviously now we might think of having, a serious mental health condition, or they may turn away pregnant women. There are obviously different reasons for this, but they would typically turn these people away. Also sometimes would turn people away who were very clearly terminal, as in like in that moment were very terminal, and so they don't admit just anyone and everyone. So if you weren't in a church-run hospital, you'd likely be at home with a wise woman, and they would normally be within your family, or they would be somebody in the local area. They would care for you, and they would treat you as best they could, along with apothecaries, because they'd have passed down sort of herbal remedies they knew, astrological ideas on treatment, and obviously we've got the 4 humours that they would be looking at as well. Lepers are kind of an interesting one that people forget about. They're not necessarily a case study of any kind, but they are a pointed out illness in the Middle Ages section. So leprosy is cared for separately in a leper house. This is a form of specialised care, obviously very much in its infancy, but leprosy is an interesting one because, as you can see from this particular painting here, we can see that obviously they felt like this was serious, divine sort of, retribution, and this was the devil's disease. They really didn't understand it. You had to ring a bell as you walked around so people would know you were coming, and everybody could get out the way, and you were, sort of banished from your community. So yeah, really, really difficult time. Obviously you've already got leprosy and you're being shunned. However, you would be receiving care from a leper house ideally. So that's the Middle Ages. They're a really great one if you get a question on care for the sick. Ideally you could talk about this time period because obviously the church is the most involved and they are focusing on care rather than cure. So the Renaissance then obviously comes directly after, so the church influence is still there. However, we are now at the point where we're looking at the dissolution of the monasteries and the break with Rome with Henry VIII. So following the Reformation and the closure of these monasteries, obviously a lot of the attached hospitals close. Yes, Henry does go on to reopen some of them, but that's not really the point. Some, for example, St Bartholomew's in London, are taken over by local authorities instead, which is really interesting because obviously the government have a very laissez-faire attitude until really the late 1800s. But they start to focus more on treatment rather than just charity and care. However, most hospitals continue to provide care in the form of food and looking after you rather than actually treating the ailment or the wound or whatever it might be. So there's a change, but it's not, really, really outlandish change. Rich people continue to pay for doctors or nurses, so physicians who would have been university trained, and they would have gone off of uroscopy or urine, as well as things like, your birth chart, star chart. But obviously, this is if you have the money to pay for them. Wise women continue to play an important role, though. They do actually linger for quite a long time. And really, even in the modern day, we could argue that they still are around. But we've now got this point, which is a difficult one, because Andreas Vesalius, he is the one that publishes Fabric of the Human Body, and he dissects corpses, which was forbidden. However, he's given permission to do this on executed criminals, and by doing this, he proves Galen wrong, which is a big deal, because Galen had dissected animals, and obviously they are not the same as humans. William Harvey also goes on to prove about the heart and the blood circulation, for example, publishing De Motu Cordis. So it really, with these things, we need to be careful when we're talking about them because they're kind of their own category as anatomy. You can link this into different answers to do with surgery and care for the sick, but you just have to be really careful in an answer because they are tricky to use. However, these two prove anatomy is different from Galen's work, which obviously then over time lends itself to new considerations on caring and treating the sick. Worth mentioning that in the AQA board, they also do Islamic medicine as well. And that is where it's pointed out that, there are many people such as Al-Razi and Avicenna who already point out that this is incorrect. But Edexcel don't expect you to know that, so you can just go from this point on. So the Enlightenment, sometimes people call it the industrial period. It really doesn't matter as long as you've got the right dates for it. So voluntary hospitals start to appear. So the 18th century or the 1700s, they see a big surge in this because people start to donate money. You do have a thing called endowments, particularly in the Middle Ages, where wealthy people would leave money in their will towards funding a church hospital. But this is where we start to see active people who are living giving money to set up these hospitals and look at how we care for the sick. So they begin to specialize as well, which is really interesting because obviously we see leprosy is technically treated in a specialist manner in the Middle Ages, but there's such a big lack of understanding, whereas we're leaning more towards here actually figuring out what's going on. So hospitals begin to specialise, they offer treatment for specific diseases or focusing on surgical care. So what could we do for this specific illness that requires surgery? So the concept of observation is emphasised as well, and in the Edexcel board, not so much in boards like AQA, Thomas Sydenham is the one that they will probably expect you to remember. He writes Observations Medicae, and this is where he would observe symptoms of the patient, he would write them down, and then he would act accordingly. So Sydenham does a variety of things, like he brings over cinchona bark, which treats malaria. He also classifies disease. He proves, I believe it was scarlet fever and measles, I want to say. He proves that they are different even though they present similar symptoms. So he's actually quite a big proponent of the Enlightenment, but with Sydenham he is focusing on observation, and Hippocrates does also mention observation, but Sydenham makes it quite a core part of care for the sick that then goes on to inform treatment and then obviously potentially surgery or whatever it might be. So Sydenham's quite a good one for this period of time. But care is still dependent on the money from people to fund these places, and obviously if you're living in a more deprived area, you won't be getting as many hospitals and as much treatment and funding, so obviously then you'd have to travel, but you might not be able to, so there's some limitations here. Rich people continue to pay for private physicians. Obviously you could argue this is still the same today with things like, I don't know, you could pay for Bupa, right? Bupa care in the UK, it's private healthcare, so similar sort of thing, but at this point you're paying for specific people rather than an actual business. But we have to remember that 1861 Louis Pasteur publishes his germ theory. This changes everything. However, it's worth noting that this isn't an immediate change. You know, he doesn't publish it and everybody goes, oh my goodness, yes, germs, we all believe you. The concept of miasma is very, very, very prevalent still. Even looking on in the 1800s, Edwin Chadwick, who publishes his report on the labouring poor of London, and he says they live in absolute poverty, he believes in miasma. So even government officials still believe in it. Will say the idea of divine punishment still exists, but it is nothing like it used to be. However, they do still believe in religious punishment. But germ theory, it's got a slow development. People criticise germ theory, such as Henry Bastian, who's an English surgeon, for example. However, this changes everything in terms of looking to the future. So obviously, answer permitting, question permitting, you could say that germ theory changes obviously how care for the sick is done. So then obviously we move to the modern period, which is modern till present, and I will say that I've noticed that COVID-19 has now been added to syllabuses. I wouldn't worry about this because it is so horrendously unlikely to come up right now in 2026. However, you know, I imagine, this is just my personal guess, if it did come up, it would probably ask you about government action rather than anything else. So, modern period then, so care shifts from private or charity-based home care to the government has a state-sponsored hospital care focus. And obviously, they did the 1911 National Insurance Act. You've got free school meals come in, you've got the pensions come in, you've also had reports done in York and London by Booth and Rowntree, you've had the Chadwick report, and obviously we've had all this stuff with John Snow and cholera, germ theories published, Robert Koch publishes about microbes, so we've had loads and loads of change. We also start to get in the 1950s the DNA analysis from Franklin, Crick and Watson, which then changes how we look at genetic disease. However, all of that is not technically care for the sick. I'm saying it to contextualise, but it's just important to note when something is care and when it's not. So, I've done that the wrong way, apologies. In 1900, most sick people are cared for at home by women. And as I said earlier, you technically could say that this is still the case for quite a lot of people. You know, they have people from their family care for them. A lot of the time it is women, depending on where you are in the world, of course. So, 1948, the National Health Service is created in the UK. This guarantees care for all sick and wounded. So, this is under the Clement Attlee government, where the health minister was Nye Bevan, and it's really important to note here that lots of students say that the NHS is just free. It's not free. It is free at the point of use, which is the important phrase to use if you talk about that. It's free at the point of use. However, obviously, you have to pay for it through things like taxation. So, it is a bit of a tricky one, but it's the best one to think about in terms of care for the sick in the modern period, right? Because the NHS, it's still here today, and it's something quite unique in the world that a lot of, obviously, most people don't have access to. So this is a really, really big one that you could remember. And obviously, it's off the back of coming out of World War II in 1945. So really important there. Specialised hospitals also being set up means specific treatments and care is given. So this again is further honed and there's further speciality done here. So again, you could link that really nicely through all of these time periods about specialist treatment. And then Florence Nightingale, obviously in the Crimea. Also can mention Mary Seacole in the Crimea. This is obviously Care for the Sick going over there and making lots of reform and change in terms of hospitals. So her legacy continues because she sets up schools for nurses, and this is something that obviously now we just know that nurses are trained, doctors are trained. However, it's Nightingale's legacy where nurses become highly trained professionals in the UK. That is really important in terms of care for the sick. So all of these things obviously link to prevention, treatment and surgery. It's all about how you actually write it and what the question is, of course. But I thought it would be helpful to go over because lots of people don't really remember much on care for the sick until it's pointed out to them. So yes, I hope this was helpful. Let me know if I could do anything else. I might do something similar for treatments. However, I will encourage you to look at, I have already done a video on preventions in the Middle Ages. So thanks so much for watching. Hopefully I'll see you in another video, and good luck with your exams. Bye.